But as I say, this is a program of imaginative storytelling. And utilizing the idea of going back in time or forward in time, this has provided considerable bases of storytelling in our particular series. I'm the kind of a guy who is now in that aging late 30, early 40 bracket, in which suddenly there is a tremendous bittersweet, poignant feeling about wanting to go back to another time. In my case, it would be the pre-war, early teens time, which were particularly happy for me. And on occasion, I will go back to my old hometown and walk through the streets and the places that I grew up in and feel a sense of, great loss that I wish I could recapture it. And I think the answer is, much as Wolf said, you simply cannot go home again. It's quite impossible.
Where are we?
You're in the middle, between the two, the real and the shadow. Right now you're in a kind of a limbo. You're neither here nor there.
Where are we?
Between light and shadow.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Between Light and Shadow, the podcast that cuts in line to take an extra turn on that supersized, super speedy carousel we call the Twilight Zone, so we can spin till we puke. I'm Craig, and I'll be the one vomiting forth a veritable torrent of fascinating facts, scintillating story synopses, and muddled musings. And floating within, like chunks of that cheeseburger I had for lunch, will be poorly conceived projectile-style attempts at humor. It's sadly unavoidable, and I do apologize in advance for what it's worth. But I just gotta be me. And come on, you wouldn't want me any other way.
Well, actually...
Shh! Let me alone, why don't you? When you think of the Twilight Zone, what pops into your head first? Is it the pig-faced doctor from The Eye of the Beholder? Is it those towering Canamints from To Serve Man? That smiling devil's head bobbling atop the Mystic Seer fortune-telling machine in Nick of Time? Or maybe it's the silhouette of a human jack-in-the-box in It's a Good Life. I'm sure we all have different go-to mental images of the show. There's really no wrong answer here. Unless it's something from Mr. Beavis, which is all kinds of wrong. The point is, the Twilight Zone is positively rife with indelible iconography. The series as a whole is a feast for the eyes. However, there's more to the old girl than just a pretty face. Some of the show's greatest episodes offer sweeter, more subtle gifts, no less arresting or unforgettable, and this week, we're checking out one of the best of them. Wait, just one? That's right, kids. I know. I'm supposed to cover 2 episodes a week. But as it turns out, I've got kind of a lot to say about this one. In its initial weeks on the air, The Twilight Zone covered a lot of very diverse territory. It began with a moody psychological mystery, then continued with a semi-comedic battle of wits between an old man and the Angel of Death, then a somber western, then a noirish tale of nostalgia gone too far, and then, for week 5, the show presented, well, another show about nostalgia, only this one wasn't noirish at all. It was a fairy tale of sorts that revealed a softer, gentler side of this brand new TV legend. Walking Distance originally aired October 30th, 1959. It's a bit of an odd choice since Halloween was the next day. Rod Serling wrote it, and Robert Stevens directed it. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he directed an episode that we just discussed 2 weeks ago, the series pilot, Where Is Everybody? And check this out. That episode opened with a shot panning down from the sky across some trees and stopping on Earl Holliman walking toward the camera. Now, Walking Distance opens with the exact same shot panning down across the trees, but it terminates before it reaches old Earl with a dissolve to a shot of a car speeding toward the camera. That's not a recreation. It's the exact same piece of film. Now, many Twilight Zones, especially the early episodes, open with a downward pan. Presumably they forgot to shoot one here, so they reused the one from the pilot. It may be just a coincidence that the same guy directed both episodes, but I don't know. There's nothing in the Zickery or Graham's book about it, so hey, maybe I'm the first person who's ever noticed it. Now, the guy in the car is New York ad executive Donald Martin Sloan. He pulls into a gas station in a cloud of dust and very impatiently starts honking his horn for service.
Whenever you're finished, mister.
How about some service?
Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I pull up to a service station, I wait patiently for the attendant to come over. We still don't pump our own gas here in Oregon. But this guy, he's blaring that horn within a couple of seconds. Rude, right? It's more than just rude. It's, you know what?
You dick!
That's right. Before he utters a single word, he's already exhibiting dickish behavior. It's interesting. The protagonist in Where Is Everybody also acted like a dick right out of the gate, which I discussed in some detail 2 weeks ago. Now, happily, our protagonist this time around quickly apologizes and commits no further acts of dickishness. Now, of course, these are script similarities and have nothing to do with the fact that the same guy directed both episodes. It's just striking how similarly the two episodes start off, which I never really noticed until I've been rewatching the episodes for this podcast. And I've seen them many, many times over the years. So it's cool that the show still holds new discoveries for me. Anyway, the similarities pretty much end there. This is a very different kind of story.
Yesterday I just got in the car and drove. I had to get out of New York City. One more board meeting, phone call, report, problem. Probably would have jumped right out the window.
Martin's spontaneous road trip has led him right to the outskirts of Homewood, the idyllic town where he spent his youth. He leaves his car at the gas station to be serviced and decides to hoof it the rest of the way, since it's not too far.
That's walking distance, isn't it?
Yeah, about a mile and a half.
Yeah, that's walking distance.
He gets to town and does his Facebook check-in at the soda fountain, where he's amazed to find out that triple scoop chocolate sundaes are still only 10 cents. He rhapsodizes to the counter guy about his childhood there in Homewood, even mentioning the owner of the place, Old Man Jenkins, who was notorious for sleeping in his office before he died. He leaves a 900% tip. Now, okay, don't freak out. It's only $1, but the counter guy seems to think he just won the lottery. And after he leaves, the guy goes into the office where Old Man Jenkins is sleeping. Wait, what? No. We are not doing that this week. At least we're going to try not to. Okay, so this joint ridiculously undercharges its customers, and the dead owner isn't really dead. Interesting. Martin meanders over to the local park and reminisces about the fun he had there as a kid, and marvels at how the town hasn't really changed at all. There's a gazebo nearby, which he remembers carving his name into back in the day, and spies a kid doing the exact same thing. I mean, the exact same thing. The kid is carving Martin's name. And it's not just any kid. It's Martin as a kid. Hey, come on. No means no. And besides, this isn't really an Inception-style multi-layered dream. And we do need a dramatic sting to punctuate these surprising moments, but not that. Let's see. How about... Ooh, yeah, I like that one. Okay, so the kid runs away, and a slightly perplexed Martin makes his way to the old homestead. An older man answers the door, who Martin recognizes as his father. The woman of the house also shows up, who Martin recognizes as his mother. They naturally think he's crazy and slam the door in his face. See, here's the thing. These two are dead. Now, Martin's a bit more perplexed now, and as he walks away from the house, he sees a teenager waxing his brand new 34 Roadster with the rumble seat. Wait, brand new 34 Roadster? Cut to commercial. Now, when we come back, it's nighttime, and Martin is prowling around the neighborhood. Serling jumps in with an atypical midpoint narration to tell us what has been excruciatingly obvious for most of the episode.
Martin Sloan is now back in time.
That's right. 5 weeks in, and the Twilight Zone drops its very first time travel episode. There will be many, many more. Now, Martin ends up back at his parents' house, where he has another run-in with his folks. He insists that he is, in fact, their son, back from the future, and whips out his ID to prove it. Now, his mother's had quite enough of his crazy shenanigans, thank you very much, and smacks him upside the head. He dejectedly leaves and heads toward the park, where he hopes to find his younger self, which he does, riding on the town's carousel. Martin jumps on and starts hollering like a lunatic, which spooks the poor kid and sends him running right off the edge of the moving carousel. Little Martin injures his leg in the fall, at which point Big Martin collapses from a sudden pain in his leg. The poor little guy is carted off to the hospital, leaving Martin alone in the darkness to soliloquize.
Won't be any more merry-go-rounds. No more cotton candy. No more band concerts. I only wanted to tell you that this is the wonderful time for you. Now, here. That's all, Martin. That's all I wanted to tell you. God help me. That's all I wanted to tell you.
Martin's father arrives. He's looked through Martin's wallet and determined that the guy is, in fact, his son, or rather a future version of him. He implores Martin to return to his own time and stop encroaching on his younger self's allotment of childhood wonder and joy. As Martin turns to go, his dad offers a bit of advice.
Maybe when you go back, Martin, you'll find that there are merry-go-rounds and band concerts where you are. Maybe you haven't been looking in the right place. You've been looking behind you, Martin. Try looking ahead.
Cut to the drugstore, present day. The place is infested with rowdy teenagers and their godforsaken rock and roll music, and ice cream sundaes are now a complete rip-off at 35 cents. Now, Martin now walks with a limp, and when the pimply-faced nerd behind the counter asks him about it, he explains that he was injured as a child right there in Homewood on the carousel. They tore the carousel down years ago, it turns out. Martin walks, limps, back to the city limits to pick up his car, and heads back home to New York, sadder but a bit wiser, and maybe a bit more able to tolerate his fast-paced, high-stress life in these modern times at Sterling Cooper Draper Price, or wherever. Walking distance. This episode consistently ranks very highly with fans, and it is very good. But I've got to be honest, it's not one of my all-time favorites. All the pieces are there. The story is great, the performances are fine, the production is beautiful, and the Bernard Herrmann score is gorgeous. But even with all that, there's something missing for me. After countless viewings over the past 30-plus years, I still can't quite put my finger on what exactly it is. I'm definitely the nostalgic type, and I usually respond very emotionally to films. Okay, I cry at movies, in other words. Fuck, I cry at commercials. So why can't I cry at this? Am I dead inside?
Well, if you ask me.
Nobody's asking you. God damn it, woman! So I'm not completely and thoroughly enthralled by the episode. But hey, I'm not the only one. Rod Serling himself didn't have a lot of good things to say about it.
I'll tell you what happened, what was wrong with this film. The chronology of the script was that he goes into the street, meets the little kid. The kid points out the Sloan house. He has the scene with the father, mother. Then he goes into the park, sees himself, chases the kid. Then Act 2 starts with his going back to the park to find the kid. The problem was that once seeing the mother, father, he can do nothing else, really. It should have been so dramatic and so traumatic that it's hard for him to even, function. You go back into time and see two people who you've loved all your lives. Everything goes downhill after that. That's the problem with this thing. His awareness of the fact that he was living in a bizarre past, that he was able for the first time in the history of man to see his own mother and father, now deceased, himself as a young man, and yet he managed to go from scene to scene living with these bizarre things. And the whole thing collapsed because of that. But you see, the problem was that I was too smart for myself. I gave a man such incredible trauma, and yet suggested that as of the moment you live through this trauma, you will nonetheless function properly and in a totally rational way, and that's not possible. And for that reason, the thing lacked complete reality to me. Well, it goes even deeper than that. The cliches were there, and the writing was really second-rate. But worse than that, I tell you, I draw such a blank at the language that the father used. It was so heavy and, again, so ponderous. Yeah, there are merry-go-rounds where you are, too. It's a truth, but it just doesn't zing you very much. Any dummy would know that there is contentment to be found if you seek it out. Nobody has to say that in the show, and that was the major problem here. Philosophy for no reason. This is, I guess we'd call that course philosophy for dummies. Never works for me now. Every time I see it, I die.
Now, if you're at least vaguely familiar with Serling's life, you know that he injected a lot of his own childhood into Walking Distance. Homewood represents his hometown of Binghamton, New York, which he looked back on very fondly. So it's too bad that he was so unhappy with the episode in retrospect. I mean, he was always pretty self-deprecating and critical of his own work, but here it strikes me as particularly sad. It's too bad he wouldn't live to see how this episode would resonate so powerfully with so many. I feel like it takes Martin way too long to figure out that he's back in time. So maybe that's part of why the episode doesn't hold any special power over me. But I wonder if maybe being fascinated with the concept of time travel my whole life has blinded me to the fact that if a person actually found themselves back in time, they'd probably need some pretty serious convincing that they really were back in time versus being the victim of some elaborate hoax, since actually moving through the fourth dimension in a direction other than forward is a pretty huge thing to wrap a tiny human brain around. So maybe Martin's slow, hesitant realization is actually completely realistic. Maybe Serling actually nailed this aspect of the story and didn't realize it. And hell, if that's the only thing quote-unquote wrong with Walking Distance, which may not even be wrong, then maybe it is a perfect episode after all. But still, I remain relatively unmoved. Every time I watch it, I hope like hell that it will finally click with me, that I'll finally be reduced to a blubbering puddle of heartbreak, but so far it still hasn't happened. And it's not that I don't get it, because I do. I completely understand every aspect of it. And there are other episodes that do make me tear up. In Praise of Pip is one, but I connect very personally with that one because I'm a dad, and I'm very nostalgic for the days when my kids were little. I was actually a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years when they were like 3 and 4 years old. And there's an intense joy associated with that period in my life that I miss. I mean, really miss. So that episode hits me pretty hard. But if I'm being honest, I'm not nostalgic for my own childhood for reasons I'm not going to go into here. And maybe that's exactly why. I don't share Martin's desire to relive his younger years, so of course I don't connect with the episode on that level. Hey, this podcast just crossed over into self-analysis territory. Who knows, I may be an entirely different person after all this is done. So yeah, this is the first of many time travel episodes of The Twilight Zone. And it's interesting. There's really no time displacement mechanism involved. No time machine, no rupture in the space-time continuum, no Kaiban time mirror. Yeah, that's right. I just referenced the Outer Limits episode Demon with a Glass Hand for the 3rd week in a row. How long can I keep this up?
Not long enough, I'm afraid.
Ooh, Dad, want some ice for that burn?
Oh, nice. 2 against 1. Jesus. I've got to admit, that was actually pretty good. Props.
Thanks, sweetie. Mwah.
Ah, you can't see it, but Teresa just blew me a kiss, and Kendall almost cracked a smile. See, it's not all slings and arrows here. We do have our moments. Now, where was I? Okay, so there's no physical contraption or scientific phenomena that thrusts Martin back in time. A lot has been written about the fact that Martin appears to travel back by way of the mirrored surface of a cigarette machine at the gas station. Kind of an Alice through the looking glass thing. But I would only buy that if he came back the same way. We don't really see him return to the present. After he talks with his father, Martin hops on the carousel, which has started spinning, seemingly of its own accord. Then we cut to a spinning 45 in the jukebox in the ice cream joint. And we know it's the present because A, they didn't have 45s in the 1930s, and B, it's playing some loud, obnoxious rock and roll song that didn't exist in the 30s. Now, I think the cigarette machine mirror thing is a beautifully conceived shot, but that's all it is. I think he just sort of walks into the past. It's his exit from the past that I find more interesting. That smash cut from the spinning carousel to the present happens too early to show us the actual transition, but when Serling adapted Walking Distance into a short story, he added a very telling bit. Behind Martin, the merry-go-round began to move. The lights were off, there was no noise, only the shadowy figures of the horses going round and round. Martin stepped on it as it turned, a quiet herd of wooden steeds with painted eyes that went around in the night. It went a full circle and began to slow down. There was no one on it. Martin Sloan was gone. So if we take Serling's after-the-fact short story version as canon, then Martin just sort of disappears back to the present, which I love. I really wish that bit had been depicted in the episode. Just extend that shot of the carousel turning for a few more seconds, just long enough so we see he's no longer on it, and then do the same smash cut to the jukebox. That seems so much more fitting for a fairy tale. He just dissolves gently through time. So no time machine, no kink in the space-time continuum. Instead, Martin's disenchantment with his life is so intense that it seems he actually wills himself into the past. This will happen in other episodes down the road. The Trouble with Templeton comes to mind, Young Man's Fancy, maybe Spur of the Moment. I almost threw Back There into the same pile, but it occurs to me that the protagonist there doesn't time travel because he wants to, or because he has any great affinity for Abe Lincoln. It happens for no apparent reason. So we'll leave that one out. In any case, it does happen repeatedly throughout the series. Unhappy people displacing themselves in time just by being unhappy. Hey honey, would you mind refilling my...
Sorry, I can't hear you. I'm displacing myself in time.
And there it is. Time travel is a theme frequently explored by one of my all-time favorite science fiction writers, Jack Finney. Now, that's not a name you generally see up there with the greats, and his output was pretty small next to someone like Ray Bradbury, but what he did write was wonderful. He's best known probably for his novel The Body Snatchers, which spawned at least 4 distinct film adaptations, the best of which was the first, in 1956, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which starred several future Twilight Zone actors and actresses. But it's Finney's time travel stories that really capture my interest. My first Finney story was Of Missing Persons, which was in my American literature textbook in the 7th grade. Around the same time, I discovered The Twilight Zone. And if you know the story, you've got to admit it would have made a perfect Twilight Zone. In fact, I actually wrote a teleplay of it as a Twilight Zone episode a few years ago, purely for my own enjoyment, or punishment, maybe. Many of Jack Finney's stories seem tailor-made for the show. In fact, in Stephen King's Danse Macabre, which I talked about a few weeks ago, he observes that Finney, and I quote, perhaps understood Serling's concept of that middle ground between light and shadow better than anyone, unquote. But why, in a 5-year run comprised of 156 episodes, many of which were short story adaptations, did The Twilight Zone never adapt a Finney story? Well, according to Martin Grams Jr., where is that bit? There it is. Big as Life on page 128 of Martin Grams Jr.'s The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. Okay, in a 1962 communication to Ralph W. Nelson, who was the show's production manager, Rod Serling stated that Finney is pretty hard-nosed about signing deals with us, unless he collects an arm and a leg plus additional other concessions that make it pretty much prohibitive to buy anything from him. That is a goddamned shame. I wonder if Finney regretted that later in life, playing that level of hardball. I mean, any association with the Twilight Zone could have only helped his career, right? The Twilight Zone as a whole is a bit lesser for its complete lack of Finney. Go ahead, hunt down some of his short stories and see for yourself. Most of his stuff absolutely nails that Twilight Zone feel. His 2 short story collections are The Third Level and I Love Galesburg in the Springtime, both of which are unfortunately way out of print. The Third Level's not that hard to find, but Galesburg is really tough. And if you do track one down, it's pretty fucking pricey. Now, the Multnomah County Public Library here in Portland, Oregon, used to have a copy. Emphasis on used to. I checked it out like 20 years ago and somehow never quite managed to return it. Now, I paid the fine, of course, which was like $20. So, hey, it was a legitimate transaction. Kinda, right? Anyway, 13 of Finney's time travel stories are currently available in a collection called About Time. But if you can score those original books, they're so fucking great. Anyway, Finney's protagonists usually do their time traveling without cumbersome time machines, just like Martin Sloan. In Second Chance, the restoration of a classic sports car allows its owner to drive into the past. In The Love Letter, an antique desk allows time-crossed lovers to correspond across the years. In Where the Cluets Are, a couple has a house built at considerable expense based on antique blueprints and gradually succumb to the pull of the past and relocate to the 1880s. Now, it's often that nostalgic allure of the past that causes Finney's characters to slip through time, and that may very well have been an inspiration for Serling when he wrote Walking Distance. In Finney's 1970 novel Time and Again, the protagonist successfully travels into the past by wearing period clothing and surrounding himself with period furniture, studying period newspapers, and basically hypnotizing himself into the past. Now, if that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because Richard Matheson, who wrote a number of Twilight Zones himself, used this exact idea for his 1975 novel Bid Time Return, which you probably know better as the film Somewhere in Time, starring Clark Kent and Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. Okay, that sounded dismissive. I didn't mean it to. Christopher Reeve, rest in peace, and Jane Seymour, both fine thespians.
Oh, if I were going to try it again, mind you, I have no such intention, but if I did, I would disassociate myself entirely from the present. Move everything out of sight that could possibly remind me of it. Then, who knows?
Now, I'm not saying Matheson stole the idea, but he did acknowledge Finney by naming a professor after him in the screenplay, so he at the very least borrowed the concept openly. But the basic idea, using self-hypnosis as a mechanism for time travel, wasn't invented by Finney either. It comes from a 1964 essay called Man and Time by J.B. Priestley, which Matheson also references in his screenplay. Anyway, I'll wrap up the Finney tangent. I like Walking Distance a great deal. I do. I just don't love it. And you may feel differently, and that's totally okay. We don't always have to see eye to eye, you and I. It is a lovely episode, and it certainly deserves the praise lavished on it by legions of fans, but as with all things, I can find fault with it, because I'm basically impossible to please.
Let the record show that he admitted that he's impossible to please.
See, that right there, that doesn't please me at all. Not at all. Walking Distance ends on a mostly happy, slightly bittersweet note, but there's also a hint of tragedy about it, which I don't think Serling necessarily intended, and I get what he was trying to do. Future Martin's limp will serve as a constant reminder for him to stop looking back and live in the present. That nostalgia can be, well, is, in his case, a dangerous thing. But what Serling doesn't address is the fallout for past Martin. Now, if the events in the episode happened because future Martin longed for that wonderful summertime of his 12th year, well, wouldn't getting a horrendous leg injury pretty much ruin that for him? He would have been laid up for months, right? Big old cast, maybe even surgery, pins and screws holding shit together while it heals, ever so slowly. Seems like his memories of that period of his life would be significantly changed, maybe even enough to make him not nostalgic for his childhood. Past Martin's perfect summer went from halcyonic to suckatonic, and for what? Martin would have learned his lesson either way, right? It was already going pretty shitty by the time his mom gave him that heartbreaking smack. I'm not sure any of the limp business is actually necessary. Oh, and the soda jerk in the present mentions that the carousel ended up being torn down. Condemned, actually. Presumably because it was dangerous. Is that Martin's fault too? How many other kids' summers did he fuck up? Okay, I'm clearly tumbling down a ripple effect rabbit hole here, and I know this is a fairy tale, so I'm not supposed to dwell on the potential time paradoxes or hard science. But still, and I keep going back to Ray Bradbury's story A Sound of Thunder, where big game hunters go back in time to hunt dinosaurs, but only under really tightly controlled circumstances. One guy accidentally steps on a prehistoric bug, and boom! All of history is changed.
It is said that if you move a single pebble on the beach, you set up a different pattern, and everything in the world is changed. It can also be said that love can change the future. If it is deep enough, true enough, and selfless enough, it can prevent a war, prohibit a plague, keep the whole world whole.
That's the closing narration from the Outer Limits episode, The Man Who Was Never Born, the plot of which spins on intentionally altering the past to change the future. Martin Landau plays Andro, a mutant from a blighted future who isn't nostalgic for the past per se, but he definitely pines for the younger Earth, the history of which he has studied from the large library that he curates. A time warp allows him to visit the past, where he intends to murder the man who will cause the plague that will all but destroy the world. But the plague that made Andro a sterile monster also gave him the power of hypnotic suggestion, which he uses to make himself appear normal. While he's in the past, he falls in love with a girl named Noelle, who he learns will eventually give birth to the man he intends to kill.
I'm too early. I'm too early.
Is something wrong?
He isn't born yet.
Who isn't born yet?
Bertram Cabot Jr.
Of course he isn't born yet. Bert and I won't be married until this weekend.
You will be his mother. You will be the mother of Bertram Cabot Jr.
Yeah, it's your basic girl meets mutant story. Now, she falls for him too and calls off the impending wedding, effectively saving the future since the man who created the plague will now never exist. Then she learns the truth about Andrew, but she doesn't care because, don't you know, she's in love? And she's now free to go with him when he returns to the future. But a horrific realization dawns on them both.
Andrew? What's wrong?
Noah, listen. We created a future into which I was never born. If you'd married him, had his child, my world would have come. But we've changed all of that. It will be all different. And I was never born.
Andrew disappears as they cross back through the time warp, leaving Noelle stranded alone. That's not exactly a happy ending for them, but we can presume that the future created by their actions is a brighter one, so the larger outcome is positive. The man who was never born is a fairy tale, like Walking Distance. However, nothing important seems to have changed in Martin's world, unless his broken leg somehow caused a 350% increase in the price of triple scoop chocolate sodas. There doesn't appear to be a butterfly effect happening here, which I guess you can get away with in a fairy tale. But if there were, if Walking Distance was a darker, more tragic kind of fairy tale, like The Man Who Was Never Born, we might have seen a very different Martin emerge at the end. One who harbored bitterness over being temporarily crippled and missing out on all kinds of gazebo name carving and carousel writing. And yeah, if he was 12, probably a whole lot of ogling at boobs. I don't know. Maybe the new Martin would be a hostile prick who wouldn't even apologize for honking his horn at gas station attendants like a total jackass.
You dick!
Maybe this Martin isn't the vice president in charge of media at the ad agency. Maybe this Martin is the janitor, limping around, dragging a mop bucket, driving a beat-up station wagon instead of his convertible. Serling actually does this to another character in the season 4 episode Of Late I Think of Cliffordville, where we have a billionaire asshole who goes back in time to relive his glory days, only to fuck it all up and change the future, where he's now the janitor instead of the CEO. Zing! Now, despite Serling's relative ambivalence about the episode itself, he had no problem with one aspect of Walking Distance, the original music score by Bernard Herrmann.
Incidentally, the score in this was quite lovely. The violins, only violins. That was the only musical instrument used. It was a lovely score composed for the show and done live. And one of the few times we did it. And very gentle music, I thought, in this piece.
As with the radio scores that preceded them, television scores were usually done with small ensembles and limited instrumentation. No giant orchestras here. Herrmann was a master at creating unique sounds with very little. And here, he uses only strings and a harp to underscore Martin's time-tripping trials. And it's beautiful. Somehow simple and lush at the same time, wistful and sad, but absolutely lovely. Walking Distance may be the single most beautiful thing Herrmann ever wrote. Now, he'd used the strings-only approach again, much more famously in his score for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho just a year later, which isn't beautiful at all. Psycho and Walking Distance are pretty far apart on the musical spectrum, but comparing them provides a great illustration of the profoundly different results the same artist can yield using the same tools on two different works. Now, I said Walking Distance is Herman's single most beautiful work, but I may need to backpedal on that a bit. That title might actually belong to Souvenirs de Voyage, a chamber piece in 3 movements with a clarinet lead. It's often compared to Herman's score for Hitchcock's Vertigo, but I tend to connect it more to Walking Distance. It has that same beauty tinged with sadness and longing. It's perfect nostalgia music. So yeah, it certainly belongs alongside Walking Distance. I had the privilege of hearing Souvenirs de Voyage performed live right here in Portland a few years back by Chamber Music Northwest. It was a special warm-up to a screening of, you guessed it, Vertigo, which happens to be my favorite film of all time. Oh, and I'd be unforgivably remiss if I didn't mention Herman's score for Francois Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451. Yeah, that Fahrenheit 451 based on the Ray Bradbury book, which, incidentally, is my favorite novel of all time. Wow, I'm name-dropping a lot of favorites this week. Now, the Fahrenheit 451 score is much more varied in tone as a whole, but parts of it are definitely of that same beauty and sadness ilk. Right? Wouldn't that fit right in with Walking Distance? I'm not the only one who thinks so. Check this out.
And this, I think, ranks with the other, psychological musical portraits he created, be they Vertigo or Psycho or Taxi Driver.
Absolutely. I think Fahrenheit 451 is exactly that.
Yes.
Matter of fact, I kind of consider that to be a companion piece to this, and that's why we included it on our album with Fahrenheit 451. The fact that it was strings and harp.
Exactly.
But definitely the emotional quality in Fahrenheit 451 is unparalleled.
That's from the commentary track John Morgan and William T. Stromberg did for the Twilight Zone Season 1 Blu-ray set, moderated by Herman biographer Stephen C. Smith. As Mr. Stromberg pointed out, they recorded both the complete Fahrenheit 451 and Walking Distance together for a 2007 album for Film Tribute Classics. Now, if you don't own this CD, pause the podcast and get your ass over to Amazon right now and order it. Seriously, what are you waiting for? I'm looking it up right now and... wait, $34 and change? Oh shit, did this thing go out of print? Oh my god, that's terrible. How the hell do wonderful recordings like this not stay perpetually available? God damn it! Wait. Okay, apparently you can still get it directly from Screen Archives Entertainment, $19.95 plus shipping. Go to screenarchives.com. Like, right now. Get it before it's gone. I'll wait. Martin Sloan is played by Gig Young, not a name you hear much these days, but he had a decent career, mostly playing supporting roles, the apex of which was winning a Best Supporting Oscar in 1969. Of particular interest for our purpose is the fact that his third wife was Elizabeth Montgomery. Yes, that Elizabeth Montgomery, who I had a pretty big crush on as a kid watching Bewitched reruns. Their marriage lasted from 1956 to 1963, so they were together during both of their respective Twilight Zone appearances. She starred in the Season 3 episode 2. Gig Young unfortunately had a long-standing drinking problem, which ended up costing him the lead role in Blazing Saddles in 1973. Can you imagine Gig Young instead of Gene Wilder in Blazing Saddles? Weird, right? Rest in peace, Gene Wilder. Gig Young would ultimately marry 2 more times, and it was during his 5th marriage that he... Whoa, wait, 5th? Damn, I'm only on my 2nd. But I'm always on the lookout for ex-wife number 3, ladies.
Hey!
Pay no attention to the succubus in the background. Anyway, it was during Gig Young's 5th marriage that his life ended quite horrifically. On October 19th, 1978, he took his own life and his wife's in a murder-suicide. A tragic end to a talented actor. I wonder if he was included in the in memoriam section of the Academy Awards that year. Did they even do that back then? Anyway, he's really good as Martin Sloan, as are Frank Overton and Irene Tedrow as his parents. Now, we just saw Irene Tedrow last week when we covered The Lateness of the Hour, in which she got seriously aroused by a back rub. And that little kid shooting marbles in the park is Ronnie Howard. Yes, the very same Ronnie Howard who would grow up to be Ron Howard and direct movies like Apollo 13 and Backdraft, but only after he played Opie Taylor and Richie Cunningham. And I'll bet people still call him Opie, and I'll bet it still pisses him off. And I'd be unforgivably delinquent in my duties if I failed to point out that fetching young lady Martin talks to in the park.
That chick that won't quit. It's like stacked, like beautiful.
You got me straight tripping, boo.
Her name is Nan Peterson, and she's a tasty morsel if there ever was one. She unfortunately didn't have much of a career, but she was busy in 1959. Aside from Walking Distance, she also co-starred in a film called The Hideous Sun Demon, which is your basic guy gets exposed to atomic energy and turns into a monster B-movie. She plays a nightclub singer and, by 1959 standards, is a bit of a woman of ill repute. She meets the main character and promptly hooks up with him, on the beach of all places, which always strikes me as hilarious. Is there a worse place to hook up? All that sand. Ugh.
Well, you don't look too bad at all. It's a perfect fit.
Oh, but this wool blanket.
What's the matter?
Are you kidding? I've got practically nothing on under this. It scratches.
Take it off.
Oh, sure.
I can see you're going to force me to be a gentleman and offer you my coat.
I mean, it's heavily implied that they hook up, even though they aren't naked when they wake up on the beach the next morning. And Nan Peterson also starred in another film in 1959 called The Louisiana Hussy, which I've sampled on YouTube, and damn, they ain't lying. She's not just a woman of ill repute, she's a straight up slut. She makes out with every guy she comes into contact with. She even chews on a dude's earlobe, which seems a bit risque for 1959.
Please don't go away. Sit down. You're not afraid of me, are you?
Looks to me like someone gave you a pretty bad beating.
No one beat me. I was thrown by a horse. You're not very friendly, Pierre. You don't like me, do you? If you got to know me, I think you'd like me.
Nan Peterson went on to appear in 2 other Twilight Zones, Season 2's The Whole Truth and Season 5's From Agnes with Love. And then she promptly disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, if you're familiar with my blog, you'll recall that I hate From Agnes with Love quite passionately. So if that shitty episode had anything to do with her giving up acting, well, I hate it even more now. Mark Scott Zicree is, of course, the author of the Twilight Zone Companion, but he didn't just write a book on the subject. He's the foremost authority on the subject. He's also a screenwriter, and a few years back, he employed his extensive Twilight Zone knowledge base for a spec script he wrote for Mad Men called Walking Distance. In it, Don Draper meets Rod Serling, and they commiserate about life on Rod's boat. It takes place in 1964, right after the Twilight Zone ended, when Rod was trying to keep the show going under a different name on a different network, which didn't happen, probably fortunately. Now, Zicree's script was never actually produced, but he did win a Writers Guild of America award for it, and it's richly deserved. For fans of Mad Men, and fans of The Twilight Zone, and of course fans of Rod Serling, it's a must-read. You can find it on Zicree's website, markzicree.com. That's markzicree.com. I'll post a link in the show notes. It's a great script, really well written, full of really great lines, my favorite of which occurs during Don's and Serling's first meeting in a bar. Serling stands up and Don is visibly surprised that he's only 5'5". Serling says, "I know I look taller on television, and better looking. I should hire you to be me in real life." That just cracks me up. I've been saying for years that John Hamm would make an excellent Serling if they ever do a biopic on him, despite their extreme differences in height. Hey, if they can digitally shrink people for those Hobbit movies, they can cut John Hamm down to Serling-sized, right? And for Mad Men, they could have totally had him play both Don Draper and Rod Serling. Guaranteed Emmy, right? Damn, that would have been cool. Too bad it never happened. But anyway, Zicree's teleplay ends with Don watching Walking Distance, the scene with Martin and his father at the carousel, then meeting up with his son Bobby. Bobby had indicated earlier that he wanted people to start calling him Chip, because what kid doesn't want an awesome nickname? Don has brought his son a gift, a jacket with the name Chip embroidered on it, and he tells him, "You be anyone you want." And this does make me tear up. Because like I said before, I'm a dad who misses those years when my kids were young, like around Bobby's age. So maybe this sort of counts as being touched by Walking Distance, just a step removed, like 1 degree of separation. Add that to my love of Bernard Herrmann's music, and yeah, okay, I'm gonna say Walking Distance, in all its forms and facets, gets me right here. You can't see me, but I'm pointing at my heart. I think we'll leave it at that for this week. I was originally going to look at Walking Distance and A Stop at Willoughby together, but, well, Walking Distance deserves its own spotlight, right? Even if I maybe kind of sort of believe that A Stop at Willoughby is superior. I know, right? The controversy. But hey, I'm not the only one who thinks that.
That was called A Stop at Willoughby. Much better than this, infinitely better.
Right? Intriguing. Makes you want to go watch A Stop at Willoughby right now, doesn't it? Yeah, it makes me want to do a podcast episode about it right now. Well, don't worry, we'll get to it in due time. Patience, grasshoppers. Questions? Comments? Hit us up at zonepod@gmail.com. That's zonepod@gmail.com. Or seek us out on both Facebook and Tumblr. Just do a search for @zonepod on either and you can't miss us. Lavish all the praise you deem appropriate upon us by liking and or sharing our posts. You know, to get the word out and whatnot. And if you wanted to leave us a nice review on iTunes, well, we certainly wouldn't stand in your way. Until next time, kids, get the hell off the internet and go spend some quality time outdoors. Maybe hit your local park, but hey, be careful on that carousel. You don't want to end up with a bum leg. But above all, play nice.
Between light and shadow.